This is Rabbi Jeff Sachs of Atid and WebYeshiva with another installment of our series looking at the Rambam's Hakdama Perush HaMishnah, the introduction to his Mishnah commentary. Good evening, everyone. If you have a webcam, please turn it on. Let's see who's here, who's with us. We have Barbara, we have Howard. Esther Marine, of course, Sherry Levin from sunny Hawaii, Yair Rand, Stuart Gottlieb. Stuart Gottlieb, where are you joining us from? Do you have a microphone, or you can just chat us? Webcam not working. Stuart Gottlieb, are you out there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm from Cedarhurst.
Cedarhurst, welcome. Is this your first time with us?
Yeah.
You've been in Usher?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I guess I overlooked you. Welcome. Okay. So here we are, we're still in the Rambam's Hakdama la Perush HaMishnah. In the seventh section of the seventh chapter, the end of this short chapter, which is nearing the end of the first part of the work, the Rambam points out to us that in the previous material, in the material that we looked at last time, where the Rambam talked about the individual versus the community, and here he's continuing that theme, which seems very far away from the topic at hand, which again is the history and mechanics of Torah She-Baal Peh. The Rambam says, "Kfar haragnu min ha'inyan asher nertzehu hariga rabba." The Rambam makes a candid admission that he's really gone off track. He's really gotten off the track, and so I'm starting with the last sentence tonight as we work our way backwards, because if the Rambam was aware of the fact that he went off track, well, we certainly also are. And we'll have to try to figure out how we got here. The topic for tonight, maybe this will take us 2 sessions, is the relationship between, well, it's really a portrait of, the perfect society. In the previous section, the Rambam was talking a little bit about what makes an Adam HaShalem, what makes a complete person. I wouldn't say perfect, but complete, whole person. And here he's discussing on a societal level. If there's a notion of what the ideal person is, how does that person interact with other people in society who are a little less shalem, and what is the role of those unshalem folks, those unperfected folks in the society. The Rambam says, "V'nishara kan she'ela achat, v'hi sheyesh le'omer lomar, atem ta'antem ki ha'chokhmah ha'elokit lo himtzia davar levatala." Nothing is created without purpose. This is an idea that he's previously discussed, that we've spent some time discussing. And all things, all creatures down here on earth, I'm paraphrasing, down here on earth, the most exalted, the most sublime, the most distinguished of all the creations down here on earth, of course, being man, and the purpose of man is, he uses this medieval philosophical term, tziyur muskalot. I will render that as getting it. You know, like when you say about somebody who's kind of smart and figured things out, you say, oh, he gets it, or she gets it. So tziyur muskalot, the forming of intelligences, of forms of wisdom, of seichel, muskalot, from the same root as seichel in Hebrew or in Yiddish. The idea that the purpose of man is to think, is to reason, is to figure things out, is to conquer the world through his mind, as it were. I was, just as a side point, I have a 12-year-old son here at home. We're actually a few weeks away from bar mitzvah, and like most kids of that age, I remember this was certainly true when I was his age, he's really very interested in space exploration, and he's very troubled by the fact that the space shuttle program is coming to an end, because how are we going to get back and forth into space, and about manned missions to Mars, and all of those kinds of really interesting things. And we were talking about the question of in the 50s, and more so in the 60s, when the space program in America was going, and the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was going strong. There was actually some discussion amongst rabbonim, amongst rabbis, mostly in the form of drashot, not so much serious halachic literature. There was some discussion about the propriety of exploring space, and if this was something that the Torah favored or disfavored. And there were actually thinkers, Jewish thinkers, who thought that we should not explore space. And this is a topic that was hotly debated, of course, in general society as well, and other intellectuals of other faith communities, as well as academics, and the man in the street, discussed the question of investing the money in going to space and allocating resources here instead of there. But there were Jewish positions who thought that man should not travel to space. After all, there's a pasuk, we say it in Tehillim, Hashamayim shamayim laHashem, va'aretz natan livnei, that the earth is given to man, but the heavens belong to God, and therefore we should not travel there. So I was really very pleased when my son said that he thought that that's not what the pasuk means. Shemayim va'aretz here don't mean the physical world and anything that's above the atmosphere, but Shemayim means a certain abstract. I guess some of the Maimonidean rationalism has rubbed off on him. Shemayim means a type of abstract realm in which God, as it were, lives. And this world, Olam Hazeh, the physical world that we occupy, that's Haaretz Shinatan Livnei Adam. And that physical realm includes, of course, space. It includes the cosmos. And as I pointed out to him, that in fact Rabbi Soloveitchik, who is of course such an advocate of the idea of creativity as a central role, as a central a characteristic of the religious personality of the halachic man. He writes about this at length in the second half of his work, Halachic Man, the Ish Halacha. The centrality of creativity, thought that if we have the capability to go exploring, to understand the universe, that it's imperative that we do that. So that's the purpose of man. That's the Maimonidean description of the purpose of man. The world is created for purpose. Man is at the pinnacle of creation, and the purpose of man is to figure it out. Is to conceive the Tziur HaMushkalot. So the Rambam asks, given that that's the case, Im Kain, Lama Himtzi Hashem Kol Ha'anashim Asher Lo Yitzayru Muskal. Well, look around. There seem to be a lot of people that just don't get it. Either they don't get it because they can't get it, or they don't get it because they're not interested in getting it. But it seems that there are very few people, in fact, the vast minority, who fit the bill of attaining and maximizing the purpose of their having been created. So what if that's the case? If the purpose of man is to be a type of rationalistic philosopher, religious philosopher, what are all these other folks, the other 99% of the people, what are they doing here? And it seems strange. You look at, I don't know, you go out and you look into the natural world and you see what are I don't know, what are salmon created to do? Well, it seems that they're created to swim upstream. How many salmon actually do swim upstream? All of them. And you look at squirrels. What are squirrels meant to be doing? They're meant to be foraging for nuts and storing them up for the winter. And what percentage of squirrels meet their full potential? All of them, or at least a very, very, very high percentage. But look at man. Man's job is to be this type of rationalistic being. Rationalistic. I mean, I'm not posing rationalism as the opposite of emotional. This is not the case. The Rambam does not negate the role of emotion in personality nor in the service of God, but rationalistic in the sense that our job is to be thinkers, is to think about things, is to figure them out. But if that's the case, the squirrels and the salmon, they're like beating us by a mile. Very few people, very few humans actually reach that potential. And be clear, by the way, read this very carefully. The Rambam is not talking about Jews. The Rambam is talking about humanity. Most people are stripped of wisdom. מבקשי תאוות, ושהאיש החכם הפרוש יקר המציאות פלאי לא ימצא אלא אחד בדור מן הדורות. You have like one in a generation that make it. Maybe he's exaggerating by saying one in a generation, but not that many. Not that many. Barbara, you ask about abstract thinking specifically. Abstract thinking is one component of it, but not the only thing. Ve'hatshuva, and the answer to this question is shemetziut kol otam bnei adam hi l'shtei sibot. There are principally two reasons why the majority of people don't seem to fit the bill that he's described. Ha'achat, the first reason that we have all of these folks hanging around, even though they don't, cross the finish line, as it were, either out of inability, a lack of ability, or a lack of desire. After all, there is cable television. Ha'achat, somebody told me, last couple of days we noticed that there was like a drop in sheer attendance here on the WebYeshiva. So somebody said that we were competing with the finales of all of these television shows. So I found that shocking. I can't accept that that's the case. But those people who would give up learning in order to find out what happened on Lost, instead of just TiVoing it or skipping it altogether, like it seems to me like that we can understand. We can understand. The Rambam says the first reason, the shamesh le'echad hahu. The first reason that all of these folks who don't fit the bill are hanging around is because they're here to serve those people that do. Now, by serve, we don't mean to be their butler. The Rambam will explain. Lefi she'ilu hayu b'nei adam kulam mevakshei chochma mitpalsefim. If everybody was a seeker of wisdom, if everyone was philosophizing, haya ha'olam oved v'chaleh, the world would be destroyed. Like the Rambam is aware that the pinnacle of life is to be a philosopher. But if the whole world was philosophers, it'd be problematic, because even the philosophers have to eat. Lefi she'ilu haya kol bnei adam v'haya nichrat min ha'adam mimenu bizman mu'at. Lefi she'adam chaser ma'od tzarich l'dvarim rabim. Man is a very wanting creature. He has many needs. He needs many things. V'haya tzarich lilmod hacharisha v'haktzira v'hadisha v'hadchina v'habishu v'asiyat hakelim v'chol. if everybody was a philosopher, so then every philosopher would need to know how to plant and how to sow and how to reap and how to grind grain and how to bake bread and how to make utensils, etc., etc., etc. Right? Just in order to get breakfast in the morning, he'd have to know so many different things, so many different milachot, that he'd never be able to get going. And he'd also have to learn how to weave and how to spin thread and clothing and textiles in order to make clothes. And he'd have to know how to hammer nails together and screw screwdrivers together. And those are things that good Jewish boys they never got involved in. I remember once, since we're talking about like the utter waste of popular culture, I'll mention my own sins. I remember once hearing Jackie Mason say that he had this routine that Jews aren't very handy. They're not good with tools, because a Jew figured out that you don't need a screwdriver. You have something better than a screwdriver. You have a butter knife. Why would you have to go looking for a screwdriver when you can do it with a butter knife? He said you can always tell a screw that was put in by a Jew. It's got a little cream cheese in it. So that's what the Rambam is saying. And you'd have to live 900 years in order to learn all of the things that you need to learn in order to keep everything going, your food and your housing and your clothing, etc. So when would he ever be able to become the philosopher? In other words, there's the paradox. If the world didn't have people that were ba'alei melacha, that could cook and could weave and could build and do all of the things necessary to keep society going, so the philosopher king, by king I don't mean a political ruler, I mean the philosopher king, the one at the pinnacle, the top of the pyramid, so he'd never be able to get there. So the Rambam is rounding out a picture in which all of these other people, and it could be that they're the majority, are serving an essential role. They're serving an essential role which enables society to produce the philosopher and the artist, for that matter. ולפיכך הומצאו אלו כולם, כדי שיתעסקו באותם העסקים שצריך להם המדינה, וימצא חכם הדרוש לנפשו. So that's why we have all of these people who are not chachamim, who are not scholars, because they're the ones that have to keep the whole operation going. And because of them, we're able to afford the luxury of having people who are philosophers. In Israel today, we call these people Anshe Ruach, men of the spirit. And very often, when we point to them, they're the authors and the artists and the academics and the people that think they have, on a week like this, when the country is very, kind of caught up with what's happening. So these are the types of people that, that write opinion pieces in the newspaper. I think that Israel is still, like that. I think America is not like that anymore. But here, the idea that you have men of letters, the other day, you don't have to agree with his position, but in the light of the events at the beginning of the week, of the events at sea. So not the next day, but the day after. In other words, we woke up in Israel on Monday morning. The events with this flotilla took place local time early on Monday morning. So the Monday morning newspapers, of course, didn't have anything. The Tuesday morning newspapers all, of course, came out in support of the actions of our government. And the Wednesday morning newspapers yesterday already started turning on our own government. But on yesterday's Haaretz, Haaretz is this major newspaper very much associated with the the liberal wing, the left wing of politics here in Israel. Across the top of the newspaper, above the headline, this is something you'd never have in America. There was an opinion piece on the top of the front page, running across the front page, was an opinion piece by Amos Oz, who's one of the great living Israeli authors, but very much associated with the left wing. This idea that men of letters will speak out on matters of public policy, and that it'll be discussed from the front page of a major newspaper is something I think that's still unique in Israel. A little bit that's what the Rambam is discussing, although to be clear, the Rambam didn't think that Amos Oz is the picture of the kind of person he's portraying. But the idea that society is run by people who are engaged with ideas and not merely politicians in the small sense of the term is part of what we're getting at, and which we'll get to further on. But in order to have a society where the Chachamim are at the top, you need to have a large percentage of people that keep the whole operation going. So when the Rambam said earlier that the point of all of those people was to serve the Chacham, it didn't mean serve to bring him his orange juice in the morning. It meant to keep society afloat so that the society can afford to dedicate resources, that there'd be a small group of such people. Umatov ma'amar mish amar lulei hamishugaim hayta haaretz necherevet. Ki eze shigaon yidme lezeh sheyeh adam chalush hanefesh rofef ההרכבה נוסע מתחילת האלוקים האקלים השני אל תחילת השישי. These are, again, medieval notions of how the world is constructed, that there are 7 spheres or seven components of the world, 2 of which aren't inhabited. Maybe they're parallel to the idea of the continents. ועובר הימים בזמן החורף המדבר בסופות אבק הקיץ, etc., etc. We can skip a little bit here. But at the end, the Rambam says, "Al kain korim hachachamim aleim hashalom l'mi she'en lo chochma am aretz." So we have this colloquial term in am haaretz. In the Yiddish inflection, to call somebody an am haaretz means to say that they're a moron. But the Rambam uses the term in a different way. Chazal already, of course, used the term am haaretz to refer to somebody, not a bad person. An am haaretz is not a bad person, but it's somebody who is not a chacham. Now, to not be a chacham, to not be a wise person, it does not mean that you're a bad person, and it doesn't mean that you're not a spiritual person, and it doesn't mean that you're not a religious person. These are independent spheres. But the am haaretz is the group of people, perhaps a majority of people, who are responsible for keeping the aretz, for keeping the land, for keeping the world. Here by aretz, we're not referring specifically to Eretz Yisrael. We're talking about the world, keeping the world running. Klamar shehem amnam humtzu liyishuv haaretz. Lefichach yichasam aleha. Those are the people that keep the yishuv haaretz, the running of the world, the populating of the world, the keeping it going. So that's one component of why there are so many people that seem not to be at the pinnacle. Why, unlike the salmon and the squirrels, very few people actually make it to the top of the intellectual pyramid. For what is it? Wasn't Rabbi Kiva referred to as an Amaretz before he learned? Was it referred to as an Am Haaretz? Yeah, perhaps. No, even Chazal referred to an Am Haaretz as an unlearned person. Even Chazal referred to an Am Haaretz as an unlearned person. And sometimes the Gemara talks about an Am Haaretz as somebody who might be suspect of not keeping all of the halachot properly, but only out of ignorance, not out of rebellion. Not out of rebellion. So the Rambam now asks a question on this first explanation, and he says, Shema, yeah, perhaps a simpleton, Howard suggests. A simpleton. But again, simpleton implies I think a person of limited intellectual capacity. And Am Haaretz is not necessarily someone of limited intellectual capacity, although he might also be that. It could be somebody who has the potential to be a chacham, but hasn't exercised that potential. And we're not limiting, it's not some kind of aristocracy. The Rambam very often was criticized for his elitism, and there's no doubt that there's a certain intellectual elitism in the thought of the Rambam. But there are two essential qualifications to that elitism. One is that he thought that it's true that there's this intellectual elite, but it's not a closed group. Others could join it if they worked hard enough. Now, it's true that there are probably some people that just, no matter how hard they work, they just don't have the capacity to make it. That's clearly true. But probably for the vast majority of people, it's not a lack of ability, but a lack of not inspiration, but perspiration, to use Edison's phrase. So it's not a closed group to which others can't enter if not to the manner born. The other thing is that in terms of the spiritual realm, the Rambam again and again and again emphasizes the notion of one striving to flesh out and perfect the performance of mitzvot, kol echad lefi kocho. This term, lefi kocho or kifi kocho, each person according to his ability. One's measurement is measured not against some objective yardstick, but against the subjective maximizing of one's own potential. It is an idea that appears again and again and again and again, both in terms of Torah study, in terms of kavanah b'tfilah, in terms of tzedakah. In terms of tzedakah, the Rambam makes a point of saying that the weight of your tzedakah is measured against your your abilities to give tzedakah. It could be that Bill Gates has more money than the rest of the planet all put together, and he gives a lot of it to tzedakah. He gives a lot of charity, but maybe he could be doing much more. Maybe he gives more charity, dollar for dollar than everyone else put together. But it's a question of, are you giving according to your abilities? So the Rambam here says, Shema Yomar Omer. Maybe someone will say, V'halo yesh asher nireh ish shotev v'sachar. But it seems that there are people that are, in fact, imbeciles, simpletons, people that just simply don't have the capacity. V'hu benachat ba'olam hazeh. And those people, they seem to be, very much enjoying this world. Ve'eno amel bo, v'zulato ya'avdehu v'yitasek ba'asakav. V'lo od ela shepa'amim yeh hamitasek ba'asakav ish chacham. Because sometimes it's the opposite. Here the Rambam is not discussing the question of why the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper. This is not a value judgment about righteousness and wickedness. But if the Rambam says the Chachamim are at the top of the pyramid and everyone else is there to keep society running so that you can have Chachamim sitting there dealing with Chokhmah, dealing with wisdom, but it seems that sometimes it's the opposite. It seems that sometimes a guy who's not a great Chacham somehow managed to make a lot of money and can sit and, drink pina coladas, while somebody who really is a chacham has to toil and struggle and work and have to be involved in yeshuvo shel olam, involved in parnasah, and involved in other things. So it's similar to the question of why the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper, but it's how come if the blueprint for creation is as how he described, how come the chachamim that have to get up and work in factories, and there are people that really have no business being involved with chokhmah, who sit in their home theaters all day. Ein hadavar kamo sheyachshov v'choshev, ki heyot oto hasachel benachat lefi shehu gam kein misharet leish asher hu kavanat haboreh. So it all has to do with God's plan, but it could be that foolish person, foolish meaning the unwise person, the person who's not in the ballpark of he's not a candidate to be one of the chachamim, but yet he sits in his home theater watching cartoons. So it could be that that's also a form of serving the world. Ki hu b'menuchato v'rov mamano o malchuto nitzavel avadav livnot armon nisa o lintoa kerem gadol. It could be that this guy, he's going to tell people. It could be even a melech. Can you imagine that there might be a king who's not a chacham, but there might be a political leader who's not a chacham? It's like remarkable that the Rambam could even conceive of such a thing. I say sarcastically. So that person is gonna, he's gonna build a palace, or he's gonna plant a vineyard, or he's gonna have someone plant it for him. Kemoshe osim hamelachim u'mishe midamer hamelachim v'yeh oto ha'armon mizuman lechasid sheyavo b'zman min hazmanim v'yechaseh yom echad b'tzel kir mikirot oto ha'armon. And it could be that the whole thing is part of a plan. It's like the plot of countless Hasidic stories. Which after all are just the embodiments of Jewish thought. So the Rambam says that guy who's not a chacham, but somehow he's in a position to sit and relax and to put his feet up. So he's going to build himself a nice house, or he's going to build himself a palace. Maybe that palace one day will serve as a refuge for a chacham, or the vineyard that he plants will here he talks about produce raw materials for some medicine, and the medicine will, of course, serve to, on a simple level, medicine will serve to further the aspect of Yishuv Ha'olam, of keeping the world running, and certainly if it'll save the life of a chacham. And it ends with this pasuk from Yeshayahu: "Eitzot merachok emunah omen." That sometimes eitzah, wisdom, good counsel comes from afar. You don't understand in the beginning why it should be that way, and that's the emunah omen, the true faith. The true faith is to think that in the long distance, in the rachok, in the merchak, you'll see why things were the way they were. But sometimes when you're, like the rat in the maze, you can't see the forest for the trees. It doesn't make sense. But when you look in the long run, so sometimes you can understand. Although you always have to approach those kinds of questions with like a certain amount of tzniut. Whenever you try to figure out what God's plan was, you always have to approach those kinds of questions with a great degree of tzniut. The Rambam goes on, and he says, Amru, Chazal said, Ben Zoma היה עומד על הר הבית ורואה ישראל עולים ואומר ברוך שברא כל אלו לשרתני הואיל והיה עליו השלום יחיד בדורו. So Ben Zoma, who one of the Tnaim, who was one of the Yachid Bidoro, the one guy at the top of the pyramid, So he'd stand there and he'd watch as the masses, I guess on the Chagim, on the Shalosh Regalim, would come up to Eretz Yisrael, would come up to Yerushalayim, and he'd say, Baruch Shebara Kol Elu, thank God, who blessed is God, who created all of these, the masses of Israel, in order to serve me, which seems, on first blush, rather egotistical, but if you understand it in the perspective of what the Rambam has been teaching us, it's true. But again, when Ben Zoma says, all of these people, the masses of Bnei Israel, they're here to serve me, he doesn't mean that they should bring me my orange juice in the morning or shine my shoes. It means that they should pursue their own lives. And if each person, it means the exact opposite of what it means on the surface. It's the antithesis of egotism. It's humility, right? And as he says, "Oh, blessed is God who created, the other 99.9% of the world population in order to serve me." No, it doesn't mean to serve me because I'm better than them. It doesn't mean to serve me because they're my servants. It's that blessed is God who created those people who keep the world running, who are fulfilling their job, their task, whatever it is that they're doing, and so that I can do what I'm doing. The meaning, if understood through the prism of what the Rambam is saying, is very deep. There's a story. I don't even know whether I heard the story from him or I just heard the story from people that tell the story. But there's a story about Rabbi Lichtenstein. I think that I heard it from him. I think I heard him tell the story. I'll tell it as if I heard him tell the story. I think the context was someone asked him about considerations in choosing a career. This was at a press conference, where that's what they call it I don't think it took place in Yeshiva at Har Etzion, where he's the Rosh Yeshiva, but this is going back many years. But somebody asked him about what considerations should somebody take when choosing a career. So if I recall correctly, he mentioned a few careers that he thought a Ben Torah should not be involved in. But then he told the following story. In Yeshiva at Har Etzion, I don't know if any of you have ever had an opportunity to visit the Yeshiva out in Alon Shvut, which is it's a beautiful facility, and it's on really very lovely grounds. It's a lovely campus with a lot of with very nice landscaping, flowers, and there's like a little moat around the building that has not exactly a moat. It's like a little man-made pond of some sort that has like those big decorative fish in it. And Rabbi Lichtenstein was driving out to the yeshiva one morning, and he saw this fellow who was the chief groundskeeper. And the groundskeeper was waiting for a tramp, was waiting for a ride to get out to the yeshiva. So Rabbi Lichtenstein, thought that he should stop to pick up this fellow who, after all, works in the yeshiva, works for him, I suppose. And they're both going to the same place. But he said to himself, Rabbi Lichtenstein said to himself, the drive out to the yeshiva in the morning, it's, the only time of the day that I really have to myself. And I use that time to think about what I'm going to be teaching and to think about the Gemara that we're studying and to do all of those things. So he thought of driving on by without stopping, for the gardener. But then, of course, he felt bad how he's going to leave this fellow standing out, on the road. He's going right to his destination. So of course he stopped, and he felt bad about even thinking about not stopping. This fellow, the gardener, who was known as something of a chatty fellow, he gets in the car, says good morning, and then doesn't open his mouth for the rest of the ride, the half hour it takes to get out there. So Rabbi Lichtenstein is able to think about what it is that he's going to be teaching, and they get to the yeshiva, and this fellow, the gardener, the groundskeeper, says to him, "Kvod Harav, I apologize. I hope you don't think that I was rude, that I didn't make conversation, but I find that on the ride out to the yeshiva in the morning, I need that time to organize myself. I need that time to think about what work needs to be done and what needs to be planted and what needs to be pruned and what needs to be weeded and etc. And I just need that time, that quiet time to think about what has to be done. So Rabbi Lichtenstein told this story as an example of this idea of the Yishuv HaOlam. I think the answer to the question in terms of what profession one should choose was that of course a life of Torah is a wonderful thing, and whether you're a gardener or a teacher of Torah, whether you're a banker or a posek, everyone has to be involved with Talmud Torah. But no matter what you do for a profession, it should be something that engages you. That if you're a gardener, that should be as important to you as being a Gemara teacher is to me. And this idea of the Yishuv Olam, it's not a critique. It's not, when we say that there's this pyramid, it doesn't mean that the fellow who's the gardener is somehow, in some ways a second rate. Every person can contribute to Yishuvo Shel Olam. Everyone can fulfill God's plan for how the world should run. And again, this is completely independent of whether or not one is a good Jew, or is a religious person, or is a spiritual person, or is completely independent. Completely independent. The Rambam now goes on to describe the second reason why so many people don't sit at the top of this pyramid. Why God should have created so many people that after all are not chachamim. There are very few people who are there. וזה דבר שחויב בחוכמה האלוהית, לא יאמר במה שחויב בחוכמה הראשונה. למה חויב זה? כמו שלא יאמר למה היו הגלגלים תשעה, וכוח ללכת שבעה. Again, he's using medieval astronomical notions. So you can't ask why the world is the way it is. Why are there 7 planets instead of 20 planets, or why is gravity work this way? לפי שאלו ומה שדומה להם חויבו במציאות הראשונה, ותראה שהם עליהם השלום כבר בארו זה. ואומר רבי שמעון בן יוחאי, על אנשי דורו, רבי שמעון בן יוחאי said about the people in his generation, אם היותם מה שהיו, ראיתי בני עלייה והם מועטים. I saw, he says about his own generation, I saw the Bnei Aliyah, the people at the top, and they're very few. Im shnayim heim ani uvnihem. And if there are only 2 of them in my generation, it's me and my own son. Mishum kach umtzu ha'amon, liot lechevra la'anshei ha'ma'ala. So he says, because you have to have, what's that song? You got to have friends. You need to live in a society. That's the nature of being human, is you need to live in society. And it can't be, since it can't be that everyone is a chacham, so we still need to have a society. There's this notion that Chazal say about learning, that 1,000 nichnasim, 1,000 people might enter the Beit Midrash, 1,000 people might enter some kind of schooling operation. But only one of those 1,000 will make it through to become the posek, or the teacher par excellence of the generation. So what about the other 999? So they're necessary in order to create the framework that can produce that one. We wouldn't have that one person without the process. Not because we have to winnow through 999 other fellows, other people, but because the presence of those other 999 in a yeshiva or in any other type of framework that tries to produce excellence are necessary for that person to find his path. You might think this is a very small purpose indeed for all these other people. Adarabba, chashuva hi min harishona. Halo tiyeh sheHashem kiyem hakofrim be'eretz liot lechevra lechasidim, v'hu amu yitpa'er v'yitromem lo agarsheno mipanecha b'shana achat pen tiyeh haaretz shmema. When we're coming into Eretz Yisrael, when the Jews are coming into Eretz Yisrael, we have to fight this fight against these other nations that didn't want to cooperate with us. So there's a question. Well, why doesn't God just get rid of them all? You know, he can do it like that and spare everyone the process of doing it slowly. So the pasuk says that. I mean, Rashi explains it in greater detail that if everyone would disappear, you know, if all the other nations would have packed out before we got here or as we got here, so that's not healthy. The whole country would collapse, and you need to have this kind of gradual turnover, so that even those other nations, the other nations which ultimately were destined to be banished from Israel, even they serve the purpose of keeping the land going. וזה עניין בעירהו החכמים גם כן, ואמרו, מה כי זה כל האדם, the end of Sefer Kohelet, כי זה כל האדם, כל העולם כולו לא נברא אלא לצוות או לצוות לזה. Right? כי זה כל האדם, the entirety of all of mankind is there in order to be of service, to be of support, to be the backup team to the Yirei Elokim. Shieh lo lechevra. This is a reference to a Gemara here at the in Brachot. Omer Rabbi Chelbo Omer B'Huna Kol Adam. Here's the Gemara. Kol Adam sheyesh bo yirat shamayim dvarav nishma'im. This is not directly connected, but the Gemara says that anybody that has yirat shamayim, fear of heaven, his words will be heard, his words will be accepted or listened to. Shnei Amar, the end of Kohelet, Sof Davar Hakol Nishma, Et HaElokim Yirah V'chulei, Ki Ze Kol HaAdam. In the final analysis, says Kohelet, everything is heard. The pshat probably means that the message of the entirety of what he's been saying is that you should fear God, because that is the purpose of man. But the Gemara darshans it, my ki ze kol ha'adam, amar Rabbi Elazar. What does it mean, ki ze kol ha'adam? This is the entirety of man. This is the purpose of man. Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kol ha'olam kulo, lo nivra ela b'shvil ze. The whole world was created for this. Was created for this. For the Yirei Elokim. Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana Omar, Shakul Ze Keneged Kol HaOlam Kulo. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai Omer, Va'amila Rabbi Shimon ben Zoma Omer, Kol HaOlam Kulo Lo Nivra Ela Latzevet or Litzavot Hazeh. That's what the Rambam quotes. Right? That the whole world, Kol HaAdam, doesn't mean the entirety of the person. It means the entirety of society, not a human, but humanity is there in order to create a society which can produce chachamim, which can produce righteous, which can produce, and the rest of the world is there in order to help make that happen. The rest of the world is there to help make that happen. And it's true, I mean, it's true in every discipline. It's true in the arts, it's true in philosophy, it's true in science, it's true and certainly in terms of to be a chacham in the definition of the Rambam, which is a kind of refined spiritual intellect. So if we want to live in a world that has that, and I do, I like to live in a world that has such people, even if I'm not one of them. But it means that I have to be filling my role. and it gives us all something to aim at. Just to finish up the section here, והנה כבר התברר מכל מה שאמרנו שתכלית כל מה שבעולם ההוויה וההפסד, that everything in the world, איש שלם, כולל חוכמה ומעשה, כמו שסיפרנו. חוכמה and מעשה, wisdom and action, which he discussed in the previous chapter. ואחר שלמדנו מדבריהם עליהם השלום, אלו שני העניינים, רצוני לומר החוכמה והמעשה, ממה שבארנו, ממה שרמזוהו, הנה אמת נכון הוא מה שאמרו, אין לו לקדוש ברוך הוא בעולם חוץ מארבע אמות שהלכה. So now the Rambam starts to try to pull it back together before this parenthetical admission that he knows he's gone off track. But we say that God's role, God's realm in this world is the arba amot of halacha, the 4 cubits, the 4 spaces, the realm of the halacha is God's embodiment in this world. That's a topic which we'll come back to. But the idea that wisdom and action together form the matrix by which God can have a presence in this world, or which we can bring godliness into the world, or which, if you'll pardon, even which we can approach being godly, that's the realm of wisdom. And insofar as the purpose of halacha, is to refine the personality so that we can either achieve this or at least strive towards it. It makes sense what these 2 chapters have been doing here in this work, which is dealing about the history and mechanics of how halacha works. It's a perfect example. It's a rich example of how the Rambam fuses law and philosophy, halacha and machshava, law and thought together. The placement of these 2 chapters within this larger technical work is highlights that relationship. There's a question which remains, which the Rambam does not address directly here, but he addresses elsewhere. And I'd hoped to get to it, but we'll have to wait until next week. I had sent you links earlier today to the Rambam's, the 15th chapter, the first volume, 15th chapter of the Mor Nevuchim, of the Guide for the Perplexed. And you have it here. It's in the link that I sent out by email earlier today, and I suggest you read it. It's a very short chapter. And it relates to the responsibility of the Chacham to society. Here in Hakdama L'Perek Chelek, the Rambam addressed more clearly the role of society in helping produce the Chacham. But once somebody reaches the top of that pyramid, or to use the metaphor from the Guide to the Perplexed, the top of the ladder, he has responsibilities. He has responsibilities to the rest of the society, and that's what's addressed here. And I want to talk about that next time. It compares to Plato's allegory of the cave, which is a very well-known, piece, perhaps the most well-known piece in the Republic. And a lot of these topics in the Rambam have echoes or echo Plato. Plato's work, The Republic, in the discussion of the makeup of the ideal society, the role of philosophers, the idea of the philosopher king. Plato has this notion of the cave. I sent you links so that you could read the chapter in Plato yourself. And I also, with some degree of embarrassment, sent you links to YouTube videos that kind of acted out in cartoon, but those would be sufficient to give you the notion of how it works. Plato has this notion of these prisoners in a cave who are chained in such a way that they can't turn around. They can only face forward. And behind them is a fire which casts shadows onto the wall in front of them. And across a bridge or a walkway between the fire and the prisoners, people would pass, and they would hold up kind of like a puppet show that would cast shadows onto the back wall of the cave, which is all these folks living down in the cave see or have ever seen. So that the reflection or the projection up onto the screen, up onto the wall of the cave, is mistaken for being reality. And then Plato suggests one of the prisoners is released, and he goes up to the surface, and he begins to see the world the way it really is, not kind of the shadow play that he took to be reality. And it takes as a process of adjustment to understand what's real and what's shadow. And first he can only, probably you've had experiences like this in your life. I remember once when I was, it was actually the summer after my own bar mitzvah, I remember we traveled someplace and we got there at night. And from the back window I looked out onto the horizon and I couldn't make out what I was looking at. I was looking at a building, and I saw the lights on the building, and I couldn't figure out like the proportions of this building and how it could be that big and yet be so far away. In the morning, when the sun came up, I realized I wasn't looking at a building. I was looking very, very, very far into the distance. What I took to be only about a mile away was probably about 5 miles away, and it wasn't one building. It was lots of buildings, which I took to be one building. It was a kind of illusion that you get, which when you get out into the light, you see things clearly and you understand what's what. This metaphor of the cave has echoes in what the Rambam is talking about here, which takes off on the story of the Sulam Yaakov, of Jacob's ladder, the angels Olim v'Yordim ba, going up and down this pasuk here. V'hinei Hashem nitzav alav, God is standing on the ladder. Vayomer ani Hashem Elokei Avraham avicha ve'Elokei Yitzchak ha'aretz asher ata shochev aleha achat nenu l'zerecha. I'm sorry, I didn't cut and paste both psukim, but the pasuk says that the malachim, the angels, are olim v'yordim. They're going up and down the ladder that Yaakov sees. And the question is, why are the angels going up and down? Angels start off in heaven. So it should be that they're coming down and then going back up. Why is the point of departure here? Why is the starting point down here and they are olim and then yordim? And the Rambam is trying to discuss this. It's in the philological part of the Mor Nevuchim, where he's really trying to explain what the meaning of nitzav, what that word nitzav is. But you can look up that pasuk and the related psukim, and you can read the Mor Nevuchim, and you can also take a look at Plato or the YouTube, and we'll try to figure out what this is. But the question really is, what is the responsibility of the Chacham to the general society? So that's where we'll pick up next week. Shabbat Shalom. I will stay on line if anybody has any questions.